insane?" All movement in the hallway paused at the sudden outburst, before rapidly recommencing as the cadets present saw from whom said outburst had originated. "Ah, Tala," William smiled, as he regarded the rapidly retreating backs of his fellow Marine Knight cadets. In no time at all, the only ones that remained were himself, his team, and Tala's team. "So nice to see you. How are your studies coming along? I hope you've not been overstressing yourself. I know exam season is coming up." Behind him, he could almost feel the rest of his team shuffling back, as the irate third year marched up to them. Not that she had eyes for anyone but him. Which might have been a romantic thought in different circumstances, though somewhat undercut in this case by the almost murderous gleam in the older girl's eyes. "My only stressor is you overgrown child!" Overgrown child. That was amusing for a few reasons. "Stop smiling!" his fiancée shouted. He did not, though he did take a moment to ruminate on just how fast his little disagreement with his mother had spread to their nominal allies. Honestly, he didn't even want to imagine just how awkward that conversation was. Sure, technically the Ashfells owed no real allegiance to House Blackstone, but given the sheer power disparity between the two houses, it wasn't hard to guess who wore the metaphorical pants in their little conspiracy. "I suppose that my mother's only saving grace in that particular conversation is that the need to talk in code would make her ass-chewing more oblique," he thought. Still, the Waykeepers were likely earning a small fortune off his family and the Blackstones, which was a little amusing in that his family was paying the crown for the opportunity to scheme against them. Across from him, Tala finally seemed to be pulling herself together, albeit with great effort. Finally, she sighed before running a hand through her hair. "William, do you truly understand what you've done? Being unhappy with our match is one thing, but to go so far as to betray your family in some infantile tantrum?" William ignored the alarmed glances from his own team, as he ruminated on the fact that his mother had clearly understated his resolve in relaying his actions to her allies. "Do you even know what my act of betrayal was?" he asked slowly. Tala frowned, discomfort flitting across her features. "Some ridiculousness about you stealing and withholding some spell from your family. Likely from the same annal you got that flashbang spell." He cocked his head. "How could I withhold a spell if I stole it from a book that belongs to my family?" Tala's expression turned grim. "I imagine it would be quite easy if one tore out the page it was listed on." Ah, that was his mother's approach. As things went, it wasn't a bad justification for why he'd had access to a spell that had been created by his family, but they didn't. Though it actually made him look even worse to an outside observer than the truth that he'd invented the spell and was keeping it from his family. In a way, William was actually a little impressed at the ruthlessness of it. His dear old mum hadn't been lying when she all but said she pulled no punches. "If that were true, don't you find it a little strange that not a single other member of my family would be aware of the spell I stole? Not one?" He shrugged. "I don't know how it is with you Blackstones, but our family doesn't invent new spells every other week, or even every other generation. Yet not only did my family invent 2 new spells, they chose to keep them secret for so long that no one currently alive is apparently aware of their purpose, let alone the methodology behind them. Instead, those secrets were left to languish in the family grimoire, to be completely ignored by everyone but me, in a book that sees regular use and updates." Those updates came in the form of the family's observations of other houses' exclusive magics, though it wasn't kosher to come out and say as much. Still, he could see it. The doubt in his fiancée's eyes as the gears in her mind whirled around. Before, inevitably, she decided that it didn't matter. "Return the spell, William," she said, "before things get worse for you." He could almost hear the stifled breaths of both teams as they waited for his response. Worse how? He was, after all, genuinely curious. "Your stipend, for one," Tala grunted. "It's cut off." He laughed. He couldn't help himself. It just slipped out. Because she said it so gravely, when it was so very much not a problem? Well, I suppose it might be a problem for a normal noble, he thought after a moment's consideration. Because life in the academy was both free and incredibly expensive. Food was a prime example of that, given that the cafeteria was tiered. One could choose to subsist on the freely provided meals the academy made en masse for the menial staff, or one could choose to pay a bit more for food that was a bit higher in quality. Naturally, the only ones who chose the former option came from House Royal, and not even all of House Royal at that. Mostly it was just those cadets who came from a menial background. William could admit that he was no exception to the rule. In his defense, it wasn't like the menial offering was bad, per se. Far from it. It was mostly just bland. Filling, but bland. By contrast, the premium alternative was usually the same base ingredients, but with the addition of spices, salts, and a medley of other items required to impart what the layman might have described as flavour. Even if the need to wolf it all down as fast as possible did often mean said flavour sometimes went to waste. "I think I'll survive," he said. "A little less red meat in my diet and a few more potatoes will hardly kill me." Though he did wince a little at the barely audible whimper that originated from Team 7's resident orc at his words. After all, he'd been paying for her too, and she'd also come to guiltily enjoy flavour. Plus, he was at least partially sure that she was bagging leftovers to send home. Either that, or she was snacking on them in the dorm. Beyond that, well, to be honest, he didn't really need a stipend for much else. Perhaps if this had happened a few weeks ago, being cut off would be a problem, but most of the components he'd need for his future inventions were already bought and in storage. "I suppose you would be shameless enough to partake of the Crown's charity where meals are concerned," Tala sighed. "But what of your armour? I've been led to understand you've also been caring for one of your teammates' equipment too?" Behind him, Verity flinched as Tala's eyes flashed over her. There was no love lost there. Still, William shrugged. The team's armour, which unlike Academy-supplied equipment came with a repair cost, was within his means to repair himself. It'd eat up a little more time than he'd like, but it was doable. "And that assumes I can't just cut a deal with the Crown as part of the spell exchange," he said. Honestly, such a caveat would barely even amount to a footnote. Before he could say as much, though, he was cut off. "I think my family can cover the cost of keeping a teammate or two's equipment in good condition," Bonlin spoke up, drawing Tala's furious gaze. "I'll just have to phrase it as an investment in my future." "The same for me and mine," Marlene said. Beyond them, Olzenia hesitated a second before nodding. "Mine too." Despite himself, William actually felt a little touched at the gesture. Not least of all because, in doing so, his friends were risking the ire of a very powerful house. Admittedly, both the Earls were from Crownlander houses, so they already were enemies in a way, but there was a world of difference between being someone's nebulous political foe and directly drawing their ire. Though poor Verity looked both guilty and poleaxed, as she looked like she wanted to say something too, but naturally had nothing to offer on that front. Which was why he shot her a wink after sending the other girls a thankful smile. "Well, as you can see, that's not likely to be an issue," he said, turning back to his fuming fiancée. "What's next?" "Lady Ashfield is considering pulling you from the academy," she said. Once more he ignored the stiffening of his friends, because, honestly, as if he hadn't been expecting that. Honestly, he thought Tala would lead with that rather than attempting the Stipend softball. "Well, I suppose I'll have to worry about that come the end of the semester, after a review process." A frown creased the girl's features. "End of the semester?" "Yes, the only time a cadet deemed vital to the defense of the capital can be pulled from their academic contract." "Pulled from that? You can't be serious," Tala spat. "That ruling is only for if the capital is under imminent threat, and it's for fourth-year cadets." William shrugged. "It's for everyone. It's only normally applied to fourth-year cadets." Specifically, it was a rule that allowed the academy to basically draft academy cadets into an impromptu militia to supplement the city guard in the event of, well, Basically anything that might threaten the capital, and by extension, the royal palace.
What threat?
Tala shouted. William shrugged. I don't know. I understand some kind of super kraken died recently. I figure that counts. Tala seethed.
That is little more than blatant exploitation of an outdated and defunct law. My family will not stand for it.
He didn't imagine they would, and they had the political power to get such a law overturned. Not quickly, though. Nothing was quick in politics, especially where the law was concerned. Well, good luck getting that done before the end of the semester. By which point it would be moot, for better or worse. Conversation complete, he turned to leave, his team falling in behind him. And behind them, Tala continued to seethe.
This isn't over yet, William. Your actions will have consequences.
He waved over his shoulder. Right back at you, Tala. I'm not marrying you, because slavery is bad. The sooner you get that, the sooner the pain stops. With that, he walked away. It was morning PT, and William felt great. Okay, that was a lie. He felt like he was about to cough up a lung, but on the inside, deep inside, he felt great. Which is why he was utterly unbothered by the 2 pairs of narrowed eyes boring into his back. All is going according to plan, he gasped finally.
Your plan is insane, Marlene responded, not even having the decency to sound winded. Though as she spoke, she did glance over to the sidelines, where a PT instructor was standing idly, her breath misting in the cool morning air. She wasn't Griffith. The dark elf happened to be elsewhere this morning, which was hardly unusual, yet William couldn't help but think that this particular absence likely related to his own actions. Still, when the woman's replacement for the morning didn't start yelling at them for chatting during PT, Marlene continued on. And needlessly convoluted, she continued on, as if the momentary pause didn't happen. Yes and yes, he admitted freely. Because it was definitely true that his scheme was desperately in need of a little kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. But in his defense, he'd been placed into a very messy political entanglement. One that, if handled poorly, could kickstart a civil war. One that was far from guaranteed to end with the side he, nominally, wanted to win on top. Sure, without the Summerfield ducal throne on their side, the Blackstones were outnumbered 2-5 by the other duchies, but said duchies were, well, soft was a decent word for it. The militaries of House New Haven and Blackstone had been honed to a razor's edge by their constant ongoing war with the Orcs in the north, and during the Solite and Lunite invasions, it had been they who led the charge. Indeed, to hear it spoken, it had been the current sitting Lady Blackstone herself who come up with the insane strategy of meeting the continental powers over open water, a move that had all but won the 2 disparate wars before they truly began. No, William wouldn't allow his distaste for them morally to take away from his opinion of their competence. And neither would the Crown, given just how cautious the current Queen was being regarding the 2 duchies' continued resistance to her desired reforms. So, complicated was the name of the day. A complicated problem required a complicated solution. With that in mind, he liked to think his plan was flexible. If something went wrong, he'd improvise. Hell, he'd been improvising. Because I certainly didn't intend to confront Tala at the end of the first semester, he thought. Nor with a team with 2 barely magic-literate menials on it. Admittedly, he lucked out on that front with getting both Verity and Marlene on his team, but he'd certainly not planned for it. And other things he'd not planned for would no doubt occur down the line, things he'd adapt to. I don't know why you're so obsessed with this, Olzenia muttered. Is she truly that bad?
Ah, it seemed his team had also finally realized just how serious his plans were. Prior to this, he wouldn't be too surprised if everyone but Marlene was humoring him because, well, his plans made the team better because he pushed so hard. Slavery is bad. I don't like it. I'll have nothing to do with it, he said, words only slightly undercut by his occasional gasps. The Queen has the right of that much, at least, and on that topic I'll back out to the hilt.
As do I, of course, Olzenia said hurriedly.
And he believed her.
At least that she was loyal to the Queen, coming from a Crownland house. He just didn't think she cared much for the woman's planned reforms. She certainly hadn't been a fan of Verity when she'd shown up. Because as much as the South was moving away from orcish slaves being in vogue, in no small part due to the opinions of the Crown, racism in its base form was still alive and well. Then again, Olzenya's antipathy might have been more a result of the implication of how far she'd fallen for a base-born orc to be her peer. As for Marlene, he still didn't know what the Dark Elf's issue with him was when they'd met, even if it had cleared up remarkably quickly. Glancing forward, he looked toward where Verity was encouraging a flagging Bonlin. Bonlin? Gasping, the dwarf didn't even turn as she responded, "Don't like it. Orcs today, dwarves tomorrow. Plus, not economically sound." "Okay," he said quickly, saving her from having to give a thesis on the topic, and in turn risking having her pass out in front of them. "Verity?" "I agree. The Queen wants to end slavery. I agree." Her words were almost snappish, which wasn't unexpected. She tended to clam up tight around politics. It also wasn't lost on him that she was pretty uncomfortable with his plans. Honestly, it was almost ironic that the Team Zorg was the one who had the least to say about slavery despite being a former slave herself. It made sense, though. At least to him, Verity wasn't a rebel. She was just getting by. More to the point, the current system had done well by her, in her opinion. Her family was free, and she was set to become a Marine Knight, something she owed to the current administration. Beyond that, she had other problems on her plate, more immediate problems. Because while the circle of favours meant the others had adapted to cleaning clothes and bedding pretty quick, one could hardly pick up an entire magical education in the same time period. To that end, Verity was still being tutored by the others, even though she had nothing to offer in return. Something he knew weighed on her, even if the notion was ridiculous. The whole point of the circle of favours was to get the team to think as a team. Olzenya, Marlene, and him tutoring her wasn't barter-based anymore. They did it because she was a teammate. In short, Verity had more basic issues on her mind than the fate of her people. Some would call her a traitor for that. William simply thought of it as normal. One problem at a time and all that, he thought. Hell, that's why I'm tackling the slavery issue first, before I even think about the current race-based class system. Did he like the current elven monopoly on power? Fuck no. He scowled. In another life, the Blackstones could have been his greatest ally. They were the only house that had negotiated their absorption into the nascent empire, rather than be outright conquered. And it was doubly ironic that the same mountainous guerrilla tactics their ancestors had used against the invading elves were now being used against them by the free orcs. Nothing can ever be simple, he muttered as he continued jogging. The only bright side was that the biggest snag in his plans was going to be untangled in the next few weeks. All they needed was the go-ahead from the Academy administration. Silence rang out across the testing range, as the sound of the spellbolts firing finally stopped echoing off the walls. Lowering the weapon, Griffith watched the many faces of her fellow instructors as they regarded the perforated dummy at the end of the range. Each of them had been sworn to secrecy on what they witnessed here today. With luck, some of them might even keep it secret. Unfortunately, in order to fulfill William's conditions, Griffith needed the approval of both the principal and 5 other instructors in order to clear his new weapon for use in the floats. Nominally, those 5 instructors would each come from different houses. In practice, there was not a hint of either red or blue in the uniforms of the instructors arrayed before her. Not a single representative from either House Blackstone or New Haven was present for the demonstration. And they'd be grumbling about that, to be sure. Claims of gerrymandering and bias. But the Crown considered the added secrecy worth it, even if it cast a shadow on the impartiality of the Academy. Honestly, Griffith knew her contact in the palace would rather have skipped this step entirely in the name of keeping the new weapon hidden, but it had been part of William's conditions for sale. Conditions they'd been forced to bow to for fear of the boy rescinding his offer and selling his invention, and it was his in truth, back to his own family. That fact alone was what allowed a single cadet to all but blackmail the ruling monarchy into following his whims. As insane and inane as they were. Honestly, a weapon capable of changing warfare across the continent, and he wants to use it in a child's training match, she thought. Proof positive that for all his genius, William Ashfield was still little more than a young man with no greater grasp of the world. All he saw was the academy. As you can see, she raised the spellbolt. This new weapon, while making use of magic, at no point touches its intended target with magic. By most considerations, it can be seen as simply an extension of the principles behind our already used bolt bows. With that in mind, I would like to put forward a request for its simulated implementation in future training scenarios, making use of both the floats and skeleton. She waited for a response, though she didn't have to wait long. Absolutely not! One woman clamoured, followed by a dozen more shouts, both for and against her proposal. Yeah, she'd expected that. So much so that the testing range was booked for the next 6 hours. And it would be a long 6 hours. Sighing, she placed the wonder weapon on a nearby bench and pulled over a chair.